to Vedanta. And, we're doing something in Oregon later this year on Vedanta and Sufism, Islam, and Meherabad. And one of the reasons that these sorts of topics occur to me is that I have the feeling that the Baba world will, at some point, be confronted by the greater world, in the sense that the greater world will take an interest. Until now it hasn't. Baba's been under the radar and nobody gives a damn. But that will change and at some point. And the Baba world, I feel, is going to have some sort of an understanding of how what Mir Baba taught relates to the greater universes of understanding, So it seems to me to be worthwhile to have an idea about what some of the great religions and great systems and philosophies and traditions have given to the world for people with that kind of interest. I'm one such person, I take an interest in it. But a lot of times I'll hear people say things and we'll just think this is just really, really ignorant about what some of the great religions have taught or where they stand, or sometimes they'll be like really representations that would be found very insulting by people who actually are adhere to those things. So for that reason, that's part of the reason why I think it would be good for those people attracted to it, to study these things a bit. At least I find it very interesting. And I always feel here at Abode, Abode, among all of Baba's Mandali, Francis was the one who really went in for that more than anybody else. Can you know of anybody else among Baba's Mandali who did? I really can't think of anybody, even close actually. So it seems appropriate here where we have this library with so many sources on these things. So that's part of the idea. Yeah.
Another thing that occurs to me, but very much in the same continuum, I suppose, is that there is a sort of a tendency amongst people whose main focus is bhakti that somehow their teacher or their guru sort of exists in a vacuum outside of a spiritual universe.
Yes, yes, that is true. That is true.
And the Baba just didn't pop up and put out all these teachings. He's part of a matrix in the imaginal world.
Yes. No, that really is true.
And it's quite a
it's deeply
quite
true,
a dangerous and wrong idea to imagine the former.
Yeah. Yeah, so there can be a tendency, of course, bhakti is the devotional aspect to worship, and that is very central to what Mir Baba gave us, and I certainly don't disparage it. But by itself, it is subject to... Vivekananda wrote an interesting books about bhakti, jnana yoga, karma yoga, raja yoga, all these things. And one of the things that he did say about bhakti as its downside is it's prone to fanaticism, which is like tremendous heart with a rigid mind without any critical discrimination and all those things. So Baba, I feel, actually gave a very beautiful balance where the heart and bhakti tend to be foremost, but there is no deficiency on those other accounts either. So I do think that a good understanding is healthy for us, and about other religions is a healthy thing too. I mean, I've tried as much as I could to study these religions, and all of them, I'll hear people say disparaging things about them, and certainly those currents are there. There's no denying that. But at the same time, within those religions, there were giants, real giants, and it's not just sometimes the things that I hear said. But so I thought to start with Vedanta. And I don't know if you guys, if others aren't interested in this, well, we'll go no further. But I'm interested in it for my own part.
Go for it.
Very.
So Vedanta is, I feel, of all the great, I don't know what you call it. The Indian word for it is a darshana, which is a system of understanding, thought, vision. Philosophy is the wretched word English gives us. I feel of all of those in the world culture that I know about, this is the one that's actually closest to what Baba has given, in my opinion. Sufism, I guess, would be the other. Although Christianity, Buddhism, all of them are, deeply interconnected. And Peter Rowan wrote a article for the newsletter. I don't know if you were editing it then or not, about Shankara, and made the case. Let me show Shankara because he's Mr. Vedanta. Here he is. The greatest figure in Vedanta, in Advaita Vedanta. And Peter cited, I think, Elizabeth and Narina, maybe Elizabeth's diary, and Baba indicating that this was a minor advent of the avatar. I've always heard that before, but this article actually persuaded me that that's true. So this is what probably the most influential intellectual stream within Hinduism. There are others that certainly are big too, and some might contest this, but on the whole, people like Vivekananda, even Ramakrishna in his own crazy way, Ramana Maharshi, all of these people, you could really say were Vedantists. Kumaraswamy would be, all of these guys. It's the probably the highest and deepest and richest philosophy, theology that was formulated within Hinduism. Although some might really take offense to that, because there are, other great traditions there too. They all kind of blend together within Hinduism, so it's kind of hard to separate. But here's something that we read in the chapter, The 10 States of God, about this. This is a quote up here. This is by Erich, but obviously, actually Ghani wrote this, but he wouldn't have said it if it weren't true. Meher Baba's gnosis upholds without equivocation both the theory of identityism, wadat or wujud, and the theory of Advaitism. And I've never seen it characterized this way before, but wadat al-wujud is an unambiguous reference to Ibn Arabi, the great, perfect master, the greatest theologian of Sufism, I would say. Died 1240. And Advaitism means Advaita Vedanta. Actually, when Ghani wrote this in the draft that we're reading in the afternoons from his book, he actually uses the name Shankara and Ibn Arabi. So this is, I think, a very powerful statement of the connection. Meherabad, it upholds without equivocation. Wadat al-Wujud, or unity of being, is a common designation for the school of Ibn Arabi. Advaitism, or non-dualism, refers to Advaita Vedanta, whose leading exponent is Shankaracharya. So that's who we're talking about today. Morning, Gerd.
Hi. No chance of sneaking in there, eh?
Not a chance. Not a chance.
Yeah. Now, what we're really, the real topic today is more narrowly Advaita Vedanta. We're talking about the other kinds of Vedanta that are there. But Vedanta means it's a combination of Veda plus Ant, or Anta. And Veda is the Vedas. It's related to a verb of seeing in Sanskrit. And Anta means the end, not the end of the Vedas in the sense of chopping the heads off the Vedas, but the culmination or the fulfillment of the Vedas. So Vedanta is like the fulfillment or the culmination or end of the Vedas in that sense. That's what it literally means. And Advaita, means not, and Dvait means two. Actually, our English word two, T-W-O, in Old English times that was pronounced twa, twa. And so you can see Dva and Twa, that they're actually related words. Grimm's Law turned Da into Ta, and so forth. So not two, it's non-dualism. And the crucial, critical, revolutionary insight of Advaita Vedanta, and I think in the history of spiritual religious thought, I don't think in our histories we really know the truth at all, to tell the truth. I think it's just the history of our ignorance about the past. But in those histories, I think it would be affirmed that this was the first time this had really been asserted. And that is not to the Atman is identical to the Brahman. And Brahman means the reality with a capital R, or we could say God. And the Atman means the soul. In other words, I am God. And that is quite a revolutionary understanding that occurred within Hinduism, and not in the other religions, actually. And a lot of Hinduism doesn't accept that, and many schools of Vedanta don't accept that either. But as you know, I'm sure, that is central to Meherabad's account also. And the metaphor that he used more than any other was that of the drop in the ocean, and it's right at the beginning of God Speaks, and he uses it in a number of other places, where the drop is actually identical to the ocean, and it is separated only by an imaginary separation, an imaginary bubbleness. There's really no such thing as a bubble. That's Advaita. So, and in the history of religions, that is a tremendous transforming understanding that happened. And it was in Vedanta that occurred. I don't know of any other religion that would unambiguously affirm that. Okay, so that's our topic. So chime in if you've got any points or questions or anything like that.
Did Shankara's disciples that continued developing the theory, maintain that not one? Sorry,
Not
one,
two.
not two?
Yeah, that was the characteristic of his school. There were divisions in his school even, but they never questioned that.
What did they get excited about?
Other schools, you mean?
Well, there were other schools of Vedanta that disagreed with Shankara.
Shankaracharya's.
Well, one of them, for example, was where I'll get to where the appearance of illusion comes from. Some said it was within the soul. Some said it was within Brahman itself. There's a big division on that particular question, and others like it. But to look I'm looking in a real broad scale here about the relation between Advaita and monotheism. And I have great respect for monotheism. I mean, the Semitic, Abrahamic religions developed it. And it looks to me like one of God's great projects with the world, actually, is to develop monotheism. And the big attack on polytheism, I actually respect polytheism too. It seems to me that's just an affirmation of the many faces of God. But yeah.
How about Zoroastrianism? Would that have
That, I
predated
guess,
the Abrahamic religion?
Yeah, definitely.
it would seem to be so.
Well, I
seem
would have
to be
thought so, yeah.
Yeah. I just not mentioning it because I don't quite know enough about it. Although I've read several books
but
on
you
it.
would assume it's...
Yeah, I think
monotheistic,
Erich said that indicated that Abraham was an avatar and was in the succession from Zoroaster, actually, in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah.
But see, we don't know much of Zoroaster. Like historians will put him at 700 BC, whereas Baba's account would put him back something like 8,000 BC. So, I mean, I just don't believe what I read at all. I just don't think we know. I noticed when I was studying these, maybe he's been pushed back farther than 700 BC by now, but I noticed that everything gets put at about 700 BC. And it struck me that the reason is because writing began about 500 BC in most places. So they go to the beginning of writing and push it back another 200 years, and so everybody's then. So I just don't believe it, actually. But yeah, no, that would be actually monotheism too. It's a little bit confusing because he has all these kind of big brothers, I forget what he calls them. But Ahura Mazda is the biggest and seems to be the chief dude.
We seem to view all of the great systems, belief systems and religions, on some sort of time scale.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's what
as if the time is more definitive than what is
Yeah.
emerging.
Well, that's the Western history of religion approach. I mean, Western histories of religion tend not to affirm the reality of all of this, but look at it as a history of ideas. And they're talking about the development of ideas and influences and all those things. And there is a dimension of reality to that. That is true, it does happen. But of course, I would affirm that there is actually a reality there beyond the understanding of that reality. But if you're interested in the history of ideas, the time and historical connections and where you got an idea from is what it's all about. Now, I'll just read. The monotheism of the Abrahamic religions posits the existence of a single personal transcendent God. It's personal God. Do you know the difference? What theism refers to is a religious sensibility that affirms the existence of some God that you are in a relationship to. For example, this is part of Vedanta too. There's a Brahman in and of itself, Nirgun Brahman, Brahman without attributes, is unapproachable. So the theistic element is absent because you can't relate to Nirgun Brahman as God. It's like a shoreless ocean. You can't get there. But then there's Sagud Brahman in Vedanta, which is God with attributes, with whom we can have relationship. Now, all of this is part of Baba's account of things too. Baba's account is quite vast, actually. But monotheism, God is definitely in a relational mode. God creates the universe. You see, in Meherabad's account, he creates the universe, but he doesn't create the universe because the universe doesn't really exist. Baba says that many times. But that would not be believed in the monotheistic religions. The creation of the universe definitely happened in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, all of those. And the God who is distinct from and non-identical with his creatures, right? So the basic insight of Vedanta, which is Atman is Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, I am God, that is heretical in all of these religions. I mean, unless you want to be an al-Halaj and get killed for it, or incur the severe displeasure of the orthodoxies. But it's unorthodox to say that the soul, the creature and God are separate. Now, there are mystics who have explored this in great depth, so I'm giving kind of a simplified account. Advaita, or non-dualism, asserts a supreme underlying reality with which all other apparently existing things are ultimately one. Right? In Advaita, the distinction between God and empirical individuals of all kinds is apparent but not real. Do you follow this? Does it make sense? Yeah. And this is definitely Baba's account of things. Now, just a little more. This is just my own thinking about it a little bit. About in Judaism, a lot of the Old Testament looks like it's kind of a tribal history, actually, of the Jewish people and the establishment of a covenant with God and a line of prophets. And it seems that to me, I mean, I'm just giving gross generalizations, but that where it was highly, the sensibility was highly developed was in areas like law and ethics, particularly. And some of the great contributions in Judaism were in those departments. And a monotheistic God, a rejection of polytheism. In Christianity, it followed from that tradition. Jesus was, of course, a Jew, but it existed within a context. They always say Christianity grew out of Roman Jerusalem. I mean, the two of them. It certainly it derived, its basic heritage was Judaic, but it existed in the political context of a Roman Empire, just established by Julius Caesar, and at that time being spread by Caesar Augustus. So there was a unifying political authority across the entire Mediterranean, which Jesus appears to have used as part of his work. And Jesus himself never challenged that. He was non-political, one of the most apolitical of the avatars. Baba was too, so was Buddha, unlike Muhammad. But it seems that part of what Christianity did was to, within that sort of Jewish framework, bring out the esoteric and the inner more, and do away with some of the ritualism, not all of it, but some of it, and emphasize the personal within that kind of monotheistic context. And Islam, interestingly enough, really, it's for all the hostility between Islam and Judaism, it seems to me they're so close to each other in so many ways. There's a large ritualistic element, a Sharia. It might be contested that Muhammad himself created Sharia law, but I don't see how it can be contested that it was created by his immediate followers based on their conviction that that's what he wanted. It certainly sure looks like it. You know, like the 5 pillars of Islam, the Shahada, which is the ritual prayer, the profession, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah. Muhammad, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and the 5 prayers a day, and the Ramadan, all these things. And there was a whole framework of a Sharia that he created. Now it seems to me like with all of these religions, these monotheistic religions, a major emphasis is affirmation and loyalty. It's almost like a personal loyalty to God. And it seems as though the supreme sin is to rupture that, to break it, to sort of repute. You can be forgiven for all kinds of stuff, but if you reject Jesus, if you reject Allah, if you break the covenant, that's the supreme sin, I would say. It's like it really foregrounds the will, the human will. The will has to hold to that loyalty to the boss, so to speak. This is just me talking, but this does seem to me to be true, anyway. And whereas when we get to the Indian Gnosticisms of all types, including Advaita, the root of it is, I personally think they're ultimately the same thing, but it's not the will the will certainly comes into the picture, but the root of the problem is ignorance. It's conceived of that way. And that's true certainly in Vedanta, it's true in Buddhism too. That we falsely, like in Vedanta, we falsely conceive this universe as existing when it actually doesn't. Now, when you get into the depths of Christian mysticism or Sufi mysticism, the same things are ultimately understood. You know, there is an ignorance there, a primal ignorance there. And Vedanta would certainly, and Buddhism certainly affirms that the Eightfold Path is kind of like an ethical teaching. You have to do good actions, good thoughts, all this. So the will gets brought into the Indian Gnosticism, and knowledge gets brought into monotheistic philosophy and mysticism also. Any great spiritual approach has got to encompass the totality of the human being. But it strikes me that the starting points are different. Does this make sense? The starting point with the monotheistic religion, in the personal sense, is really with the human will and getting it aligned correctly. Whereas the starting point in these Indian Gnosticisms is dispelling ignorance, really. Just in the way of broad distinctions between these huge rivers of spirituality we've got here. Now, here's some more about, here's a little thumbnail about what Advaita Vedanta is. Originating in certain of the Upanishads, I'll say more about those in a minute, which were composed in ancient India during the first millennium BCE. Advaita Vedanta is famous for articulating the view that the soul, the Atman, is identical with the primal reality, Brahman. Vedanta, literally the end of the Vedas, is the darshana, that's the word used, or philosophical school based on the Upanishads, and actually the Gita also. And Advaita means non-dual. The most famous post-Upanishadic exponent of Advaita Vedanta is Shankara. They seem to now date him about 700 AD, although they used to say 780 to 820. In India, dating is really hard. Indians were not into history or time very much. So the real greatest philosopher of Advaita Vedanta was about 700 AD, but the founding texts were composed about 500-600 BC, so long before this, actually. So the root of Vedanta, you could say, would be the Upanishads. Do you know what the Upanishads? I don't know if you're acquainted with
I
it.
don't know the history. Who developed the Upanishad?
Okay, I'll go into that in a minute. Here's a little more, so that we understand the broad, that Vedanta is one current in many, many others in ancient India. Now I'm not knowledgeable enough, and it would take forever anyway to review all of these, but here are in about the first millennium, there were deemed to be 6 orthodox schools of Hindu philosophy, and these are called darshanas. You know our word darshan, you have Baba's darshan? It literally means a seeing. So I think actually darshana is a really good word for it. A darshana is a philosophy, but it's a vision of reality. 6 fundamental schools, each with its own, it's like a window in reality, something like that. So it really expresses it very well. And so Vedanta is one of these. Let's see if I can get this to work. And yoga, I'm sure you'd be acquainted with, right? And like the yoga that's taught nowadays, what do they call it?
Hatha yoga.
Hatha is the physical.
Yeah.
And there's is it Astanga yoga? Do they call it that?
Oh, that's yeah.
Which is Raj Yoga. Raj Yoga, where there are 8 steps in it, those, and it culminates in samadhi, like that. That still is taught. I mean, a lot of the yoga you get is based on that. Patanjali, whose great work is called the Yoga Sutras. It's probably the 3rd century AD or so. And it's quite readable. It's still, you can easily get it. I've read it myself. He is one of the great founders, probably the great founder of the primary school of yoga. You can read, Baba will refer to Raj Yoga here and there. In Listen Humanity, there's 2 or 3 pages on it. And that would mean Patanjali, that school of yoga. So that's one of the 6 great darshanas. Another is Sankhya. I'm mentioning these because these are relevant to Baba. And Sankhya the most important distinction, most important idea is Purusha and Prakriti. Have you encountered these before? This is in the Bhagavad Gita. This is central. And actually, there's a lot of current Ayurveda, I think, is kind of based on Sankhya in a lot of ways. The three, that's my impression, I could be wrong. But it also has, have you heard of Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva, the three gunas, the three threads? Well, Purusha is the self with a capital S, and Prakriti is defined as primordial nature. And what this vision of things is that the true self looks out, and this stuff of creation, Prakriti, keeps molding itself into forms that we see or experience. So everything you're looking at is Prakriti manifesting as this form and that form, this person or that person. And it's all, in the end, Purusha dissociates, stops identifying with Prakriti, and experiences itself. We call it God realization. So you can see the relationship with Baba's own teaching. Baba refers to Purusha Prakriti in certain places. It's a number of places. This is one of the major schools of thought in India. There might not be many people now who would be solely, followers of Sankhya, but it's found its way into everything else, I'd say. So Purusha is a name for the person or the self, the root self. Yeah.
Do you think it's contradicting the Advaita? The
Yeah, it is. It does. You're exactly right. It's dualistic because it sees Purusha and Prakriti as separate from each other. So it's a dualistic.
More in line with monotheism? Or is that not?
Yeah, in a sense you could say monotheism tends to have a dualism too between God and creation, which are separate from each other. Some extreme mystics in monotheistic religions might say that I'm God, but actually very few would go that far. Very, very few. And among the Christians, they'll have a divine union, but will be kind of vague about what exactly that means. Yeah, so this is a dualistic system. Also, it's an atheistic system. There's no overall God. In Sankhya, it's not spelled out that it's like each individual is Purusha, but it's not exactly said that all Purushas are one and the same. So it's kind of a, kooky system in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I'll skip most of the others, but Vedanta would be the most important. The last segment of knowledge in the Vedas, or the Gyan Kanda section. Vedanta came to be the dominant current of Hinduism in the post-medieval period. Its three major branches are Advaita, non-dualism, Vishishtadvaita, or qualified non-dualism, and Advaita, or dualism. So there is a dualistic kind of Vedanta that says that the creature and Brahman, or God, are separate from each other. Now, the Hare Krishna movement would be Vishishtadvaita. Would that be right? Or Beda, they sometimes say.
Yes, simultaneously one and different of Chaitanya's.
So that's called Beda. So even within Vedanta, there was a lot of reluctance to actually say, I am God. And you can see why. It's kind of a dangerous teaching, right? It's the great risks are incurred. In one of these Tiffin lectures that will get published in May or June, Baba talks about this. And he says that to assert, I am God, on your own part, to say that Baba says it and I say it because he does, that's one thing. But to make that assertion on your own is a crime worse than murder. So.
And some of the schools, for instance, the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition that the Hare Krishnas represent around the world, they were they were considered Shankaracharya and the Mayavadis to be, totally deluded.
Right.
And
Yeah.
weren't interested in any contextual knowledge or sharing, where do we fit in the big scheme of things.
Yeah, there's really a lot of reservations about Shankara from other schools, because it is an extreme teaching that the entire illusion does not exist and that I am God. It's a dangerous teaching, actually, because you can have bogus masters. It sort of invites uncritical assertions that I am God, and that can be utterly destructive to community. It can be destructive to ethics. It can be destructive to all kinds of things. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's coming in this section, but where does the Vaishnava school fit into all of this? I mean, Tony just mentioned the Gaudiya Vaishnavas with the Krishnas, but I mean, what are we, barbarian Vaishnavas, or, we're certainly Vaishnavas.
Yeah,
Vaishnava.
Vaishnava.
Connected to Vishnu.
We follow an avatar of Vishnu, and on the front gate, Baba gave us that avatar's abode. It's not Christ's abode or Rasul's abode. It's
The avatar is the
we are
Vaishnava
firmly
term.
Hindu.
Vishnu descends as the avatar. That's from teaching the Puranas. I wasn't going to go into that because you see, within worship Vaishnavism and within Shaivism both, which is the worship of Shiva, you've got all of these. Hinduism is maddening. It's like everything got put into the same pot and all mixed up. So within Vaishnavism, within the Hare Krishna movement, it would be Vishishtadvaita, or they call Veda is a term, difference, non-difference. Veda, I think it's Veda. Difference and non-difference. I both am God and am not God. The sort of I am God is sort of going too far. So there you have a blend, but what would you call Ramakrishna? I mean, he had a Vaishnavite. It's sort of, so you've got all of these currents.
He would be Vaishnava. The organisation, the modern Ramakrishna organisation, is called the Vedanta Association in the West.
And I would say that Vivekananda was an Advaitin.
And Ibn Arabi with he, not he?
That sounds like Veda. I mean, I feel that Ibn Arabi was playing a dangerous game.
He got away with
two universes at the same time.
Yeah.
But then Baba gets tricky too, where he gives some talks where he says, well, I'm the avatar, but you are also the avatar. Each one of you is the avatar.
Yeah.
When did you live?
He died 1240. It's amazing that he lived to die a natural death. In view of the stuff that he was saying. But he was unbelievably brilliant. Like Shankara. Unbelievable.
What was his book?
His book?
Yeah.
There are 400 of them.
Oh, okay.
And his most famous, The Meccan Revelations, is about 4,000 pages long.
So I suppose his enemies just couldn't face reading.
They couldn't get through
he was in Makkah getting into trouble, and he did beat it out of town.
Yeah.
He actually left Spain, good thing, because Spain became very rigid and orthodox. Spain never followed him at all. His influence was in Persia and India, not Spain. And but somehow or another he negotiated his way through his life. I don't know how he ever got away with it.
Well, Ward, it's yet to be seen whether you die a natural death.
I'm totally conventional within a Baba framework. I'm right down the center, man. I accept everything he says, as far as that goes. Well, so these are some of the schools, and you can see where Vedanta goes into that. Now, there are also, they're giving you the broader Indian context. I'll go back to the Upanishads in a minute, but there are other major things going on, like one of them is Buddhism, which emerged maybe 500 BC, and is regarded generally as kind of a heresy or a deviation. The critical point of distinction within Orthodox Hinduism, all of these would be Orthodox Hinduism. The word is actually astika, which means, where do I have that? I have astika there somewhere. There's nastika and astika. Nastika means unorthodox or not straight. And those would be Buddhism, Jainism, and there's Karvaka, which is kind of a early form of materialism, like what we have in the modern worldview and its sciences, and Ajivika, which is its own deal. I won't even try to explain that. But the critical point of distinction was whether they accepted the authority of the Vedas or not. That was the divide. And Buddha appears not to have done so. You know, we could have a session like this on Buddhism if you guys were interested. I mean, I can't pretend to be a great expert on things, but I have studied them to a certain extent, if that's of interest. But Buddhism is sometimes said, perhaps it might not be fair to say so, to be atheistic. But that can be very misleading in terms of what atheism is today. But what it means is that Buddha himself does not appear to have affirmed the existence of a God or of a supreme being. Yeah. It's not clear that he denied it either. He simply, and what I've read, would not speak about it. He would not get into metaphysics. He gave as an analogy for this, if somebody gets shot with an arrow and is dying and a doctor comes, should the doctor say, who shot the arrow? And what tribe did the guy who shot the arrow come from? And what wood was the arrow made of? And where did the tree grow? Or why did he shoot the arrow? What will happen if the doctor asks those questions? The patient will die. The point is to cure the patient of the disease. And Buddha said, that is what I'm doing. And the disease is ignorance, and my task is to cure that and all these other things I won't go into. So actually Buddha was non-metaphysical in that way. That's actually the most accurate way of describing him. But there too, we could, if you're interested, we could do this another week. But the first noble truth is the second noble truth. Actually, it doesn't appear in the Noble Truths in a clear form, so let me just say it. The root of the problem is ignorance. The whole cycle of suffering is caused by ignorance. And if you dispel ignorance in Buddhism, you eliminate suffering. Now that's the very same as you have in Vedanta. So even though Buddhism and actually there's a very great philosopher of Buddhism named Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna. Have you heard of Nagarjuna? He was like the 2nd century AD, and he's I've always wondered if he was a perfect master. I've always imagined he might be, but I asked Balna too, and he didn't know. But he was like an Ibn Arabi, a figure of such stature in the 2nd century. But what is it written in Nagarjuna? No, I've forgotten, but he has some of the great ideas. The idea of nothing and emptiness that he articulated is central to Buddhism even today. A lot of Buddhism today owes enormously to Nagarjuna. But the dispelling of, yes, the school of Nagarjuna and Shankara are often compared to each other as being quite close. The school of Nagarjuna is called Madhyamaka. The Madhyamaka. His book is called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, and it's only about 80 pages, and it's one of the most difficult books I've ever read in my life. Or it's one of the most devastating books. So you can see that Buddhism and Vedanta are, in this respect, very close to each other. They both see the root of the problem as ignorance. And the solution to the problem is the dispelling of ignorance with true knowledge with a capital K. So there was a common climate of opinion going on in those days.
So ignorance and wanting.
Yes, wanting is a consequence of ignorance.
Consequence of ignorance, not in itself.
Yeah, ignorance is the cause of it. There is this thing in And then if we wanted another time, we could go through the 12 nidanas. I don't know if the 12 nidanas, the chain of causation. This is the causation that keeps the wheel spinning. And the wheel is what creates all illusion and all experience for us. And the root is ignorance. And out of ignorance comes samskara. And I've been trying for 5 or 10 years to ascertain whether this is the same thing as Baba's sanskaras. And I tend to think now that they are related. So the idea of sanskaras has a root in primordial Buddhism. And sanskaras gives rise to consciousness. Consciousness gives rise to the identification with name and form. I am Steve, I have a certain body. And then through the organs of discernment, your senses, seeing, hearing, etc., you experience the world. This whole cycle, it's quite a profound analysis given the 12 nidanas, but the root of it is ignorance.
And when in yoga philosophy, the vrittis and the klishas, the samsaras are the result of ignorance. They are what we get to deal with as a result of our ignorance. Kind of like that.
Yes.
So they're like impressions or imprints.
Yes.
That Baba's word sanskara must have come from somewhere.
Oh, it's the modern version of samskara. It's the same word.
Yeah.
M in Sanskrit became N in the modern Indic languages.
What about Pali?
Pali?
What?
Did you say?
Pali, yeah.
I've forgotten what it is in Pali. Pali, there's some characteristic changes, but a lot of the earliest Buddhist texts were in Sanskrit. It's just that they got almost all destroyed by the Muslims. So happened. You know why the Pali ones survived? It's kind of a fluke of history. Was that the Pali texts were the ones that made it down to Sri Lanka, and they survived because the Muslims didn't get there. So we have a lot of the Pali scriptures, but there were as many Sanskrit scriptures. And a lot of it got translated into Chinese, and the translations were so excellent that they can actually reconstruct them, probably even the very words used from the Chinese. They're genius translators.
And when you talk about ignorance, this is not knowing God. If that's what the definition is.
Well,
it's
they
not
wouldn't,
like not
they
knowing
wouldn't
your
put
maths.
God there in Buddhism, but
but
taking, however it would be conceived there, taking shunya, nothingness, to be real. Buddhism, at least Mahayana with Nagarjuna, got as far as shunya. Have you heard of shunya? It means emptiness. But it would not affirm. But Baba actually said the Buddha's mistake, it's directly related to this, was in saying that the goal was nirvana. What nirvana is the realization of the nothing with a capital N. But Buddha's mistake was not in affirming that the realization of God was what immediately follows that, of the everything. Buddha got as far as the nothing, but never would talk about the everything. And Baba said that that was his mistake, as a matter of fact. So that Buddhism is an interesting subject in itself, of course.
Impulse accumulations, what a great phrase.
Yeah, it is. It is for samskaras, Now, just some of the other I just want to emphasize that Vedanta exists. India is like an ocean of every kind of philosophy and development, because there have been so damn many masters and saints and gurus and bogus gurus and everything is, so much has happened there over all these years. And everything gets all mixed up together.
And all the subsets, the Ganesh, the Kali.
Yeah. So you have Ramakrishna, who's, he was like a Tantric as much as anything else, for heaven's sakes. He was a devotee of Kali. You know, have you seen some of the images of Kali? Holy smokes. You know. And he was a great bhakti, and at the same time he was a great Advaita. And he had as one of his great disciple, Vivekananda, who was like a highly Western trained, acute, intellectualized spiritual giant too. It's one of the most interesting relationships in modern spirituality, but he was a tantric, I would say, in many ways. But this is one of the huge developments in Hinduism and Buddhism also, from about the year 500 or so. It really rose then. There's a lot of Tantric Buddhism. And what we tend to associate with Tantra is like the sexual Tantra, or eating shit, or eating human brains, or these sorts of things. And there's something called the left-handed Tantra, which has that. But Tantra is not, it's sort of the sensationalizing kinds are the ones that caught on in the New Age, hip, modern West, and it sort of gives a distorted picture as though that's all that there is. And even those things are not really understood.
A lot of the Tibetan imagery is pretty full on in that Tantra.
Yeah, you do, yeah. I mean, Milarepa
Yeah.
would be a Tantra.
Yeah.
There's all those kind of magic tricks that they say were miracles.
Well, at one end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
it's the magic tricks.
Yeah, there
At
is.
the other end of the spectrum, it's
Yeah.
um,
A lot of the mandalas would be expressions of tantric. So there's a meditational, mystical side to it too. I'm not a big expert on it. It's every kind of thing. You can definitely go into dangerous waters if you're going to tantra. There's no denying that. And Baba never encouraged it, I would say.
Kundalini is related to Tantra, isn't it?
I would call it more in Raj Yoga. It's closer to Raj Yoga, the yogic kind of tradition. And there may be a lot of overlap. I'm not quite enough of an expert in it.
Agora, too.
Agora, there's a book, 3 books, Agora, recently. Have you ever seen it? You've seen those, yeah. And they're apparently quite authentic. It was about this tantric in Pune. He was died in the 80s or so. And they're wild.
Vimalananda.
Yeah. So Tantric, also called Tantrism or Tantric religion, is an ancient Hindu tradition of beliefs and meditation and ritual practices that seeks to channel the divine energy of the macrocosm or Godhead into the human microcosm. And I've come to see that microcosm is central to Meherabad's darshana philosophy also.
Did you say macro or micro?
Macro-micro relation. That's right there in God Speaks, and in infinite intelligence especially. In order to attain siddhis and moksha, so those two siddhis are occult powers. So there's a lot of occult powers. And moksha is liberation, God realization. It arose in India no later than the 5th century CE and had a strong influence on both Hinduism and Buddhism. So that's another one of the big parts of this mix of all these different things.
But in Buddhism, it's related more to the Tibetan Buddhism, isn't it?
That's where I would associate it. Now, it may have been more widely spread, but I wouldn't know. And I would tend to think it would be more in Buddhism than elsewhere, in Tibetan Buddhism than elsewhere, because Tibet had contact with
That's
India.
where it's combined with that Bong religion.
Yeah, the Bong religion got mixed into it too.
Yeah.
Now, whether there was Tantric Buddhism in China, I haven't heard of it, and I'm more doubtful. I don't know if it would have gone. It was a little bit earlier. It actually only reached that later.
Query the phrasing of the last bit about the channeling into microcosm, macrocosm. Like what's going on there? Because it's entirely dualist.
Yeah, no, that's kind of a.
So is it consciousness? Is it about?
I have a whole big rap on this and Baba too. Baba gives the same thing, that the human form is a microcosm representing the universal realities of things. The parts of the human body have a profound significance. And so that's what a yogi does in doing miracles. You connect with cosmic currents of energy, with the streams of them within your physical body. Baba says this in one of the Tiffin lectures. You connect them and do things. So microcosm. we could go into this another time. Even in God Speaks, the relation between the body and the universe is precisely between the microcosm and the macrocosm. It's quite a significant principle, actually. Now, coming more into Vedanta, what Vedanta is. The Vedas, you always hear about the Vedas, you know, and they're the foundation for Hinduism as we know it. But the funny thing is that almost nobody reads them anymore. And Hinduism has nothing to do with it. Like the gods of the Vedas are totally antiquated. They have about as much relevance to modern Hindu worship as Zeus and Hera and Apollo have to do with modern religion in the West. There are people like Agni or Indra or Varuna. No one worships them anymore. So it's sort of the Brahmins would recite the Vedic hymns, especially from the Rig Veda, in their rituals, but that has nothing to do with contemporary worship. It's kind of a funny phenomenon.
I picked up a book called the Metaphysics of Zoroastrianism when I was at Myrtle Beach. Phyllis gave me. Very small book, as scholarly as you might get from because it's such. But puts that point that's in the history of India, that documentary series that Sim's got. That the Rig Veda is a giveaway that the people that occupied, both Persia and the northern parts of India, brought with them a teaching.
Yes.
And the Zoroastrian teaching and the early Vedic teaching were pretty much the same story because they arrived with the same group of people that migrated to those parts of the world.
Linguistically, Sanskrit and Old Persian are close. They're both from the same source.
But the gods and the demons are kind of...
Yeah, they got reversed. Ahura Mazda. Ahura is related to the Sanskrit word the Asuras. And the Asuras in ancient Indian mythology are the demons, classic demons, whereas Ahura Mazda is the good god. So God reversed in that case.
And the devas are like the devils.
Yeah. So there's a relationship, but it's become inverted even by the earliest
Weren't the Aryans the ones who have meant to have brought the Rig Veda to the subcontinent?
Yeah, I don't know what the current scholarship on the whole subject is.
I mean,
the Aryans would be a name for the Indo-Europeans, that group that, I don't know where they now say they originated, somewhere like
some of the Arctic Circle or something.
In the south, it might have been somewhere like, not Afghanistan, but around the Caspian or somewhere like that. And they went out in all directions. So the Indian Sanskrit is derived from it, Persian is derived from it, Greek, Latin, Germanic languages, Celtic, all of them are.
The Mumbai Museum concurs with that theory. What's the name of the guy who wrote
Michael Wood.
Michael Wood concurs with that theory.
Yeah.
This book, The Metaphysics of Zoroastrian, concurs with that theory. So
it
seems like that's where the scholarship is at this point.
Well, the relationship between these languages is indisputable. For the last 250, 300 years, it's been well understood that English is related to Sanskrit.
And the fact that the Rig Veda makes many mentions, but as you say, current Vedanta has little reference or interest in the much earlier.
Yeah. Now, my impression is the Rig Veda, much of it this is the most famous of the four great Vedas, the Rig Veda. A lot of it is Vedic hymns. And I would not be at all surprised if some of them weren't composed by perfect masters. But they're in a very ancient language. And a lot of them became associated with Vedic ritual performances. There was a lot of use of a fire, Agni, and sacrifices connected with the fire. So they became absorbed in, maybe they were composed in that context, probably were. ritual worship and ritual sacrifice. And there tend to be hymns to Varuna is one of them, or Indra, or other various gods.
And Zoroaster,
they're very beautiful and they're very deep, but they're not philosophical. Yeah, sorry.
Zoroaster was born into that milieu and that cultural tradition.
Yeah, that was very related, what was happening in Persia. Of course, you know, Zoroaster, one of the questions is, when the hell did he live? You know, that's a problem.
Well, you just assume it was before Ram, as Baba said, and who gives a damn? Like, there's so much speculation on Ram.
I mean, it could be. Baba has once said that Zoroaster, I think he said it was 8,000 years ago. That was way before all of this, so who knows what all of this is. But then there are 4 types of texts. These are the collections, but the Samhitas would be the original hymns. But the last category are the Upanishads. So the Upanishads are actually encompassed within the greater category of what we call the Vedas. But the Upanishads are very, very different from the Rig Veda hymns. They're hymns, they're not that long, like a page. And I find them very beautiful. I think there must have been giants who wrote them. But they're, you know, praising God and that sort of, the God of the hymn. They're not philosophical, really. But the Upanishads are. They're a kind of proto-philosophy. And this is where Vedanta comes from. So you can see they're the end of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and they're the last category encompassed within the Vedas. Upanishad literally means sitting at the feet of. So it's supposed that this is what was gleaned sitting at the feet of masters. Oftentimes the great teachers in all of this, including the Rig Veda and so forth, and the Upanishads, are called rishis. You've heard of the term rishi. And Baba would comment on the great rishis as in a respectful way, as if he's talking about ancient masters. And I'm sure there must have been a lot of perfect masters in it. In the Upanishads, for example, the most famous 2 are these 2, the Chandogya and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads. Those 2, they're the 2 earliest, and probably the 2 most important. And you'll read in them about, like, Yajnavalkya is one of the great rishis there. And when I read about him, I feel as though I'm reading about the sayings and deeds of a perfect master. Sounds like that to me. And there are others like that there. And so what these, like these, each of these, okay, here's what you, again, in India, everything expands to an enormous scale when it comes to text and stuff. Like in the Mahabharata, if I'm a great warrior and I shoot an arrow, it's not worth including the Mahabharata if it doesn't take about a page for the arrow to get to its target, and for Indra and all the other gods to be involved. And it goes 1,000 miles and kills 1,000 warriors, and it's like this spectacular scale of everything. I think I totaled up the number of soldiers. The Pandavas in the Mahabharata are outnumbered enormously by the Kauravas, their enemy. And they give, for each 10-foot soldiers, there was 1 elephant. For each 10 elephants, there was 1. So I did the math, and I think the number of people in that army, which was greatly outnumbered, was 111 billion. So I think the whole world right now is about 7 billion.
In the Kauravas. In the Kauravas.
This is the Pandavas.
Oh,
the Kauravas had a lot more.
Number.
This is just young men of fighting age. And in the course of that war, every one of them got killed except for the 5 Pandavas. So it was quite a bloody war. I don't know, 500 billion people got killed. So, India is like that, So if you start with 1 Upanishad, you wind up with 200. All right, so anyway, sometimes they're called the end of the Vedas. They span a time from about the 7th or 6th century BCE through the early centuries. So about 500-600 years they were composed. There are about 200 of them, of which the first dozen are the oldest and most important. So at a bookstore you might see the 12 principal Upanishads. The Barhadi, Aranyaka, and Chandogya are the two earliest. They are edited texts, some of whose sources are much older than others. The two texts are clearly pre-Buddhist, and they may be placed in the 7th or 6th centuries BCE, give or take a century or so. When they say pre-Buddhist, it doesn't necessarily mean before the life of Buddha. It means before evidence of Buddhist influence. The three other, and here are some of these are some of the important ones. So that's, now here are, they're called, the influence of the Upanishads was particularly evident. All this is the foundational texts of Vedanta, right? Advaita Vedanta too. There are certain Mahavakyas, they're called. Maha means great, and Vakya means a saying. I forget what the word is for lawyer, but it's related to Vakya. People who talk a lot. And these are some of the most important things that keep getting quoted. You'll have long stories and anecdotes and stuff like that in these Upanishads, and then you'll have certain sayings that were the foundation. They're kind of proto-philosophical. So here's one of them. Prajnam Brahman, that is, consciousness is Brahman. Now this is one of the crucial doctrines of Vedanta, and you can see the relationship with Meherabad too and the role consciousness played. Self or God or the reality is identical with pure consciousness. Pure consciousness itself is God. Here's another one. Aham Brahmasmi. Aham means I, Asmi means am, and Brahman is Brahman, God. I am God. Aham Brahmasmi. Baba quotes that several times. It's right there in the discourses. Baba equates this with the Al-Halaj, the great Sufi perfect master's saying Anal Haq, which means I am the truth, or I am God. And he was, crucified for saying things like that. Okay, Tat Tavam Asi, that art thou. This is a famous saying. There's a rishi whose son goes off and gets schooled by another guru, comes home after a while, and the son thinks that his dad is just an old fart and doesn't know a damn thing. And in the course of his dialogue, learns otherwise, because his dad is actually a great master. And his father starts explaining that oceanic reality, that Brahman, the sole existent in the universe. You are that. Tat Tavam Asi. You are that reality. So it's sort of saying you are God. It's another statement of that. These are foundational to this insight, Atman is Brahman. And the Mandukya, this Atman is Brahman. Atyatma Brahma. So the soul is one with God. These are called Mahavakyas, some of the most important sayings in the Upanishads. And this is what the Vedantists tend to go back to, is just gleaning a handful of critical verses from the Upanishads. Actually, there are three great sources or canonical texts. I think Shankara himself identified these. Adi Shankara. Adi, by the way, means first. There is today a Shankaracharya, someone in that lineage, holding that office. So they will use Adi Shankara to refer to the original, the first one. Has three standards called Prasthanatrayi, literally 3 points of departure, 3 standards. Later, these were referred to as the 3 canonical texts of reference of Hindu philosophy by other Vedanta schools. They are the Upanishads, so we've just been talking about the Upanishads, which is the last category of Vedas. The Bhagavad Gita is also accepted. And this is a little bit, I've always found this a little bit surprising, because, the Bhagavad Gita is actually part of the Mahabharata. I don't know if you know the Mahabharata. It's that great Sanskrit epic, fantastic story about the great war between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Of course, you know.
Several billion.
Yeah, where 500 billion people got killed. Yeah. So the Gita is actually part of it. And in the formal categorization of Hindu literature, there are two great categories called. Oh, I used the wrong kind of pen. Oh God.
Have you got a bit of metha?
Yeah, I'll have to.
If you've got a bit of metha or
Where would I find some of that? I'll have to get this
you
off.
know that one with alcohol that you wash your hands with?
Yeah, I know.
That will take it off.
Okay, well, I need
Did
to
you use myths?
Yeah, I just used my myths, yeah. Okay, that'll come. There's two categories, Shruti and Smarti. And Shruti means literally what is heard, and Smarti means what is remembered. So Shruti is the higher category. It's like revealed truth, directly revealed by God. And Smarti would be like traditional lore. So the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are actually Smarti. They're not as high a category as the Shruti. So actually the Bhagavad Gita is from Smarti. It's not such an honorific category of literature. But even so, for some reason, it has been singled out and is probably the most influential of all Hindu scriptures. I don't know who the hell wrote the thing. It was like
Wasn't Vyasa? Is he supposedly the one who wrote the Mahabharata?
Yeah, but you know, the Mahabharata is a vast composite, and it's like 100,000 lines long, and like the Iliad might be 8,000 lines long. So again, it's huge. But Shankara himself singled out the Gita, and Baba spoke very highly of Gita. I saw an unpublished remark where he really praised it. So that's another of the major sources. And the third is called the Brahma Sutras. Maybe composed maybe between 200 BC and 200 AD, something like that, by somebody called Badarayana. And it's not that long, maybe 20 or 30 pages long, but it's a formulation of early Vedanta from the Upanishads, and it probably the greatest book of Shankaracharya's is his commentary on the Brahma Sutras. I've seen that characterized as the greatest work of Indian philosophy. Shankara's is called the Brahma Sutra Bhashya. Bhashya means a commentary. So the Brahma Sutra Bhashya is maybe the greatest work of Indian philosophy.
It's not terribly accessible though, is it?
No, it's very difficult. Although Shankara, actually, his writing is beautiful. It's very appealing. I find it to be so, and many others have too, but you sort of need to know the context of it. It's a commentary. So Shankara actually was a commentator for the most part. That is to say, he would take early texts and write commentaries on them rather than speaking in his own voice. Baba, the avatars themselves didn't do that. They always kind of started over. Jesus kind of, spoke on his own, irrespective of the script, by Old Testament, Torah, and Buddha did the same thing, and Baba did also. Baba never, quoted somebody as a basis for his own authority. He stood on his own 2 feet. Avatars seemed to do that, but this minor advent didn't. And so Shankara would always refer to the scriptures as infallible, and he was just an interpreter of them. Now, among the schools, we're almost, okay, I better jump a bit, but some of there are different schools of Vedanta, as I mentioned. Advaita Vedanta says that God and the soul are separate, and Advaita says that they're one and the same, and Vishishta Advaita says that they're the same and different, both of those. And one of the reasons that Advaita got rejected by many later people, and this is a very interesting reason, it's a good reason, is that they wanted to have scope for love. And if I am God, how do I love God? What do I do? Get a mirror and say how beautiful you are?
Yeah.
You know? Okay. Yeah.
What else?
Yeah, but
The original selfie with a capital S.
yeah. So they wanted, like someone like a Ramanujam, wanted to say that God, you are separate from me so that I can love you. It's actually a good reason. So bhakti flourished better in a non-Advaita context. So Baba has bridged that. He's given, his teaching is really Advaita, but it's very strong love-centered. And so we can talk, that's an interesting subject too, how those two get reconciled. You can see that Advaita can give rise to problems, and one is how within Advaita do you create scope for love?
Well, the drop ocean analogy is a powerful tool.
Yeah.
To my way.
Yeah, yeah. So now here are some of the major themes of Vedanta. Let me see. These are the different. Okay, I won't even go to this. I'll say one of them, the most important single idea in Advaita Vedanta is that the soul and God are identical. The drop is the ocean. I am God. And you can see in Baba's account of things, that's totally at the center. The end of the divine theme is the I am God realization. Okay, that's pure Advaita Vedanta. Another really big theme that Shankara really developed was the idea of Maya. And Maya is the cosmic illusion. And it's what creates the appearance of diversity when in fact only God exists. And now that's the huge obvious challenge if you say that God alone is real. Somebody says, well then where the hell did all this come from? Right? To say God alone is real is to make a statement that starkly contradicts our experience, except for those of you here who are God realized. Okay? That is to say, when I look out, I don't see God at all. I see only a universe. So if you say God alone is real, you're asserting that to be real, which we don't experience, and asserting that to be unreal, which we do experience. This is the problem that it faces. I mean, how do you subscribe to such a system of belief? So a lot of Shankara is actually dealing with that question in all kinds of brilliant, subtle ways. And a key term that he used was Maya, which is the principle of ignorance. And Baba has taken that right into his account also, centrally. Interestingly, one place where you won't find it is in God Speaks. Isn't it funny? You won't find the word except in the supplement, one part of the supplement. He doesn't use it in the main text at all. But the discourses have 4 whole essays on the subject of Maya.
So in Hinduism, Maya is both a conceptualization, but also a goddess.
God is what?
Goddess. A goddess Maya.
You know, in Buddhism, sometimes it's characterized as a goddess. Maya has a lot of different uses prior to a Shankara.
Isn't she somebody's consort?
I don't remember that. I don't recall that. But sometimes Maya is characterized as an illusionist, as a feminine illusionist.
Maya Devi.
Maya Devi, yeah.
That which is not.
Now, what the relationship is between that and the Advaita Vedanta school, I'm not sure. These things were developed in so many different ways. But I would say in Baba's account, he's very explicit, and whether Shankara is so much so on this matter, I don't know. But I would say Maya to Baba is the principle of illusion that makes the reality seem unreal and the unreal seem real, or makes the everything seem to be nothing, and the nothing seem to be everything.
If you look at the go back to that yogic stuff again about ignorance as a kind of the primary problem. If ignorance is misidentification, that solves the whole problem. It doesn't matter what you're identified with. If you know, if you know you're falsely identified, there's no problem anymore.
Yeah, I know.
If all identification is false.
Right. I mean, Infinite Intelligence is a great book for this, because there you look at the imagination, which is Maya, which is illusion, and you say, I'm that. You see, this is actually, Sankhya is the same thing. Prakriti, Purush looks out at Prakriti and says, I am you, when I'm not. So Sankhya is a great school of philosophy, actually. It's a major teaching there.
But there's both the negative and positive aspect of Maya. Because Maya is the illusion that supports reality as well.
Yes, it's true. And it makes possible experience. It makes it possible for us to have those experiences that eventually lead us to the I am God experience. Without Maya, it could never happen.
And Maya is also the beloved, in a sense.
Baba once said that Mara was Mahamaya, the great Maya. He called her that, actually. The beloved of the beloved.
In other words, you've got to have that sense of separation.
Right.
So that you can do the loving part.
Yes.
If you're in the world of God realization, you're not going
There's
to
no
have
scope
this
for
love
love.
experience. Right?
Act. Love can't act because
Yeah.
I am the one I love. I am unity.
Yeah.
Which is why it's
The
a
question
lila.
can't arise. Yeah, it's a lila. Yeah. Now, this is a major idea of Advaita Vedanta. These are difficult Sanskrit terms. Paramartika Sata, Vyavaharika Sata, and Pratyabhasika Sata. There are levels of reality. We don't have a language for it in Baba's account, but he clearly affirms all of this. Paramartika Sata is like Sat, Satchidananda, the truth. Ultimate truth is that Brahman alone exists. That's the supreme reality. But that is not the reality that we experience. Most of us would be in Vyavaharika Sata, the plane of worldly existence or empirical reality. That's the universe that we experience. And Pratyabhasika, that's illusory existence. Like water appearing as a mirage, or objects of persons in a dream. Shankara was insistent that when you're dreaming, that's not the same level of reality as ordinary reality is. Or else you're going through a desert and you see a mirage. So that would be a false, an illusion of this kind of reality. So there are 3 levels of reality. By the way, in a fuller presentation, I'd come to Nagarjuna, the giant of early Mahayana Buddhism, one of the founders of Mahayana, they say, who had a similar idea of an ultimate reality and empirical reality. So if you're going to say that God alone is real, you've got to have an idea like this. In other words, you have to recognize that we're not living in this level of reality. If you see a scene and people in it, you're in this one or this one. You're not in that one. So Shankara was developed this quite a bit about levels of reality.
It's Sanskrit words, aren't they?
Yes.
They're really beautiful sounds.
They are.
Yeah.
Sanskrit is a great language. Francis in Stay with God, several places, goes on about how Baba chose English, language of the most gross people who have ever lived on the face of the earth, who have forgotten about God most long and most consistently. Abandoning, the great languages of like Sanskrit or Persian or Arabic, these magnificent languages. I personally think that those of us, the West, should continue our long, noble tradition of looting and should loot these languages for these words.
If we could say them.
Yeah, that's the verb. Hara Martika Sata. Here's
Well, we do a bit of looting in poetry, spiritual poetry.
yeah. We should just shamelessly do it because the English language needs these words. We don't have a vocabulary. The English language is a great language, isn't it? So it's had great poets like Shakespeare and Milton and people like that, but it's not. Its spiritual vocabulary needs to be enriched by a lot of these words. I'm absolutely certain of that. Here's another really big Vedantic idea that Baba has really absorbed a lot of this, sort of expresses. If he was Shankara, it makes sense. You know, these states of sound sleep, dream, and wakefulness. I don't think that any special significance gets attributed to these things certainly not in a scientific view. They'd be viewed as subjective states, but they don't have any relationship to the reality of things, especially. And in other religious traditions also, I'm not especially aware that a lot of significance was attributed to them. But in Vedanta, it certainly was. Because self or Atman, which is the same thing as Brahman or Paramatma, as Baba says, right? The God, is identical to consciousness. It actually is consciousness. And I thought a lot about this, and I thought, if I were to ask, who am I? Why not ask that question, right? And just honestly, as best, I'll think, well, I can remember when I was 5 or 6 years old. I can sort of remember that. And I can remember various times in between. And back then I had this little body, and when I was 20, I had a young man's body, and all these, and I was in this condition or that condition. I was thinking this thought or that thought, and it seems like everything has changed. But there was one thing that was constant, and that was there was somebody who was conscious, and I can remember it. Somebody was there and was conscious. So if I were to say, what has been consistent through the entire duration of my life, I would say consciousness. I can't think of anything else. And also Vedanta has the idea of saksin, which means a witness. Somebody was witnessing and was conscious. Wouldn't you say that's true? Everything else is subject to change and has changed. I've been strong, I've been weak, I've been smart, I've been stupid, I've been attractive, I've been repulsive, I've had money, I've not had money. All these things are in flux, but consciousness is always there. So Vedanta takes the radical step of saying self is pure consciousness. That's what it is. Now there'd be a big discussion about how that relates to Baba's own teaching. I personally think it's probably the same. But then in that case, the obvious question arises, well, what about the different states of consciousness? Sound, sleep, dream, and wakefulness. Those are the three, right? So Jagrat is the Vedantic term for ordinary wakefulness, like what we're in right now, unless some of you doze off and go into svapna, or dream state, or else, if you really need to catch up from last night, sound sleep, sushupti is sound sleep. Those are the three vitiated modalities of pure consciousness, which is prajna, that has these different modes. But beyond all of these is the fourth state, turiya, which is pure consciousness, which is, Baba characterizes it this way, is being wide awake in the state of sound sleep. That's what God realization is. So these are the 4 parts, quarters, or pada of the self or of consciousness or of prajna.
Is that where the state 9 and the 10 states of God, Turiya, Avasta state?
That's a real oddity because Baba used Turiya in all kinds of different ways. And there's the 9th state of God, when it actually, Turiya literally means fourth. Turiya Avasta means the 4th state. So that's a real puzzle, actually.
Do you find the 9th state in the 10 states puzzling?
No, but I find it funny that Baba used this term for it. Whereas in Vedanta, it doesn't mean that. It means God realization. The realization of supreme reality is what Turiya Avasta means. So you can see these modalities of consciousness, right? There's ordinary wakefulness, which is false wakefulness. There's the dream state, and there's the sound sleep state. Now what Shankara says about sound sleep is that pure consciousness is actually there, but it's covered. It's like the sun under an eclipse, and it's only conscious of itself, but it's a covered consciousness of itself. And that's why it is that when we wake up in the morning, we're aware that we have been asleep. We couldn't have that awareness if consciousness hadn't actually been there. But in Turiya Avasta, that self-consciousness is uncovered, and you know it. So those are the four parts of the self. So you see, Vedanta, of all the great traditions, is the one that deals with consciousness most centrally. I don't see that Islam does in the same way. God is he. Whereas in Vedanta, it's the subjective I am that. Prajna is the same as Atman, is the same as God. So now Meherabad's God Speaks is a story of consciousness, actually. The whole thing occurs within the modality of consciousness. So this is a huge Vedantic aspect of Baba's teaching also.
So you're rightly pointing out how vast the acceptance and understanding of Vedanta is in India.
Yeah.
And I guess if in contemporary India, if you're living in a family that it's observant of the feast days and things, you're getting some connection to this. But what about in the Indian education system? Does any of this stuff get taught?
I'm not knowledgeable enough about it, but Vedanta and Advaita Vedanta is huge even still. There are major schools of it. People come to Meherabad. So if you studied the history of Indian philosophy, you couldn't miss Advaita Vedanta. It's probably the most important single school.
So I'm just thinking in terms of young people in India today. Where are they absorbing this from, apart from their family situation?
Well, there's a real turn towards materialism in India right now, so there's not nearly so much as there would have been even 50 years ago, I would think. But it's so pervasive in Indian civilization that anyone who studies Indian tradition very much is going to engage all of this.
Where is mystical Christianity? Where does that go to find these truths? Where does it go back to?
Well, it seems to me that maybe the most important characteristic of Christian mysticism, these things are vast. If you go to Meister Eckhart, you'll get to something that begins to sound like Vedanta sometimes. That's often, Meister Eckhart, he was the German, great, giant.
What year?
He died maybe 1220 or 1230.
The 1200s were a busy time, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. They really were.
Real hotbed.
All over the world. In
Dark
Europe,
Ages.
in the Middle East, in India. What's his face? Ganeshwar was around then. All these great figures.
Well, where did he go to find this? Who was he?
He was a great perfect
He was a
master
perfect master.
in Maharashtra, not far from Pune.
You're talking about Meister
Meister
Eckhart or
Eckhart.
Ganeshwar?
No.
She's
No,
talking about
Meister
Meister
Eckhart.
Eckhart.
Oh,
Yeah.
now that I don't know about. I've always wondered if he wasn't a perfect master, but I've never had that confirmed. But he died about 1220, and he went to Paris and got that was a big period. Thomas Aquinas had been there in Paris. He was a little 20, 30 years before, who I think was probably a great soul. Aquinas was a genius for sure. But Eckhart was a great mystic and said things to begin to approach this. But overall, it seems that Christian mysticism where its real strong suit and what it really developed was love. Love for God. It was very strong in that department, in that.
For Jesus.
So you have Francis and Catherine and St. John of the Cross and all of them.
It seems to me like studying these religions, the most important one to study today would be Islam. Well, to understand it,
right.
you need to understand it, don't you think?
Well, it certainly has a very prominent role in contemporary affairs.
It's quite accessible too.
I like the Quran myself.
There's so many different versions, isn't there?
The biographies on Muhammad are excellent.
Now let's see if there's, since we're almost out of time, if there's any other big, okay, I know these are imposing terms. Let me just mention them. There's a lot of discussion about causation in Vedanta, right? Causation is a big philosophical concept. Like science is always looking for the causes of this, the causes of that, right? And one of the big issues in Indian philosophy is between Satkaryavada, the view that the effect pre-exists in its cause, and Asatkaryavada, the view that change is real and the exist does not pre-exist in its cause. So like a scientific view would be Asatkaryavada, that there's nothing in the cause that necessarily the effect isn't there. You can have a convergence of different causes in the material universe. But Vedanta and Sankhya both have it that the manifestation is an expression of what is already latent in the causing subject of it. Now, Sankhya, that's where Purusha and Prakriti, right? I haven't really explained it fully, but all the different transformations of Prakriti are real transformations of Prakriti into different states. But Advaita Vedanta has it that the transformations are illusory and never really happened, that nothing ever really happens. And that's, I'm going through this very quickly, I know, but that's called Vivartavada. And I would say definitely that that is Baba's point of view too. In fact, I have a particular passage where he even talks about this. And when I read that, I thought, by God, he's referring to this very question in Vedanta. The theory of unreal manifestation, according to which the world is an appearance and Brahman is real. Advaita Vedanta espouses Vivartavada. That is, all these changes occur apparently, but they don't occur in reality because the reality is never modified or transformed at all. It's only God. There's no real change that happens. So that's the view that Shankara espoused in Vivartavada. There's some...
Ishwa, like everything.
Yeah, it's all apparent. So the creation, Baba sometimes would say, nothing ever happens, right? That's Vivartavada. It's apparent, but it's not real. So this is an important doctrine of Advaita Vedanta also, and it differentiates it from a lot of the other schools who would say that there is a real transformation even though the substance of it was inherent from the beginning, but it's taken on a new form, a real new form. But Advaita Vedanta would say no, it's an imaginary form, nothing real ever really happened. And the one last idea, which we could really spend a whole 2 hours just on this, it's such a big one, is Adhyasa, he calls it. His great treatise, the Brahma Sutra Bhāsya, Bhāsya means commentary, his commentary in the Brahma Sutra, begins with a long discussion of Adhyasa. And actually generations of students have memorized this. It's so celebrated and so famous. But it's his definition of superimposition. It's how it's translated, and the word is adhyasa. And what adhyasa is the apparent presentation to consciousness by way of memory of something previously observed in some other thing.
Is there a translated text?
That's it.
Yes, this is from the Brahma Sutra Bhāsya. No, this is the translation of what Shankara says. It's not just.
Doesn't Baba say that too?
I think so. It is.
The sanskaras
Right.
are
They're precisely this.
a memory and of something overlaid on the previous memory.
Precisely. It looks
Yeah.
like to me.
Yeah.
Like, so let me read this again because
Yeah.
there's a lot here.
Yeah.
The apparent presentation to consciousness by way of memory of something previously observed in some other thing.
Mm.
And an analogy that's often given just to explain the idea is, if you, in an Indian village, say in twilight, I'm sort of giving, Bobby used this analogy too in the 1920s, suddenly see a snake, right? Jump in terror, but it's actually a coil of rope, right? So you're superimposing the memory of a snake upon a rope. Okay. So it's actually, but in a more radical way, our whole experience is nothing but this. Because our sanskaras are memories of things that happened, which is what you're saying, in the past, and we're superimposing it on the present. When what is actually here? Nothing but Brahman, nothing but God. That's all that's really here. But we keep superimposing on that blank slate the memories of the past, which is what adhyasa is. There's a beautiful quote, in fact, maybe I could very quickly find it from, I just copied it this morning, of a discourse where Baba says something that really makes me think of this. Where was it? No, it's not there. Let me just take 1 second, see if I can find it. If I can't, then I guess it wasn't meant to be for today. No, can't find it. Anyway, there's from one of those early discourses, one of the 4th or 5th discourse, I think the beginning and end of creation, Baba talks about how our experience results when you superimpose the nothing on the everything. It's an appearance created in the everything, in the nothing, against the background of the everything. It's a beautiful, beautiful explanation. It seems to me it's very, very related to Shankara's whole talk about.
Can you pop that back again, that quote, Mary?
From Shankara?
Yeah.
This is one of the most famous, here's where it comes from. It's from the opening section of it. The apparent presentation to consciousness by way of memory of something previously observed in some other thing. This is one of the most famous. I would say this first 2 pages of the Brahma Sutra Bhāsya are the most famous pages of Indian philosophy.
Does adhyasa in Sanskrit tie in with sight or anything like that?
I don't know. I'd have to look
Because
it
in
up.
the Gita, the Gita was visualized by Vyasa and narrated, and he could see it.
Yes, that's right. He was actually seeing it.
Yeah, he was seeing it.
It was by, what's the name of father of Duryodhana? Dasaratha. Was blind.
Blind, yeah.
But he had someone who could see the whole war happening and was describing the whole thing to him. Let me see if I can. I know I put it in here this morning. All these things we never got into, of course. This is a fantastic passage from Robert. Fiddlesticks. Anyway. Okay. Well, we should probably stop. It's 20 minutes. No, I don't know if anybody, for future things of this, whether come or not. Do you have, like one topic I could also talk about is the Tiffin lectures, which will be coming up in a month or so. But we could have something on Buddhism or Islam. So, are there any things that you would find to be interesting?
Well, Sufism would be
Yeah.
certainly.
I could give it a whirl. It's I have to do it anyway for when I get to Oregon. Maybe something on basic Islam and what Sufism is in relation to
Islam
it.
as it relates to Islam, yeah. That would
Yeah.
be really good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
That would be fun.